Hello all! This is going to be another tutorial video. This time we're showcasing blending modes, lighting, and effects that can be added to sketches or finished pieces to make them a little bit more visually interesting. I've often been told that the lighting I use on my pieces is really cool, and after a poll to decide the topic of this tutorial, I decided to show you how I go about adding these kinds of lighting effects by using blending layers and modes. I'll go through a few methods actively, and then later on I'll show you the specific layers I used for several of the pieces I showed in the beginning. For this, I have two different pieces to play with, this sketch that I've been using as my profile picture, and this lined and colored piece that I never really did anything with. For the most basic concepts of dynamic lighting, we'll start by choosing a shadow color. These can be any dark color, although I usually go with a dark blue, and in this case I'll choose the navy blue again and start on a new layer. With the actual application of the color, it can be very versatile. Here I begin by adding the shadow color to the undersides of objects. In my mind, the light is coming from the upper left, so I add shadow to anything the light wouldn't hit. Once we're happy with that for now, we'll add a blur. This is going to be a reoccurring theme for the whole video, lots of Gaussian blur. After softening the edges of this color, we'll change the blending mode of the layer. This varies depending on what program you're using, but in this case in Clip Studio, the menu is right above the layer panel. For shadows, I almost always use the multiply mode. It gives a good shadow feeling that I think isn't too strong. After this, we'll lower the opacity as much as we see fit. It's a lot of visual estimates and seeing what looks good. Now that the shadows have been placed, let's look at colors for midtone or base tone. This can really be any color, although I recommend that you keep it neutral and not too saturated. For this one, I'll choose a color that isn't blue. I picked a reddish pink. Adding the midtone is similar to how we added the shadow. However, this time we'll add the color in places that aren't quite in direct light but aren't quite in the shadow either. This is part of the reason it's called a midtone. Add another blur to this layer, and we'll begin experimenting with what blending mode we want. I flipped through a few just to see how they look: overlay, soft light, and hard light. This time I'll go with soft light and adjust the opacity to my liking. Lastly, let's look at highlight colors. These will understandably be very light depending on what kind of imaginary light source we have. For this first example, I chose a desaturated yellow. Adding this highlight is similar to the first two colors, but this time I'll use a smaller brush and less highlight overall. It can be pretty intense, so I only want a little bit of the effect. As usual, add blur and begin to play with the blending modes. For this one, I chose vivid light and lower the opacity a bit. Here's a quick before and after. There's already a lot more depth. One other thing I often do to tweak the colors of a piece is change the tone curve. Again, this varies depending on the program, but in the dialog box that appears, you can adjust the amounts of red, green, and blue. Experiment with this. I find some settings I like, and I change this layer to lighten on top of the colors I already had. There we go! A lot more depth, even on just a sketch. Let's switch to the other piece and experiment a bit more. First, I changed the background to a dark color, like the shadows we used before. I want the environment to be darker than in the first example. I then decide to use a subtle gradient for a little bit more depth. I start adding the shadow as we did before, then blur and choose a blending mode I like before changing opacity again. For the lighting here, I want to use a bright neon. Let's start with pink on the left side, blur, blending mode, and opacity. Often hiding the layers and showing them again can give you a good idea of how a layer is affecting the piece. I'll blink through the layers a lot just to get a look at how I want the colors to show up and continue to tweak the layers as needed. We'll use a saturated cyan color for the left side. In this case of imaginary lighting, we have a dark room with a pink and cyan neon light coming from either side. Blur, blending mode, and opacity. I like how this is looking, but I want to show in the background that the light is coming from off of the canvas. This time, adding a Gaussian blur isn't enough, so I use the blur tool and blend it all out some more by hand. Then test the blending modes and lower opacity. I want this piece to appear even darker, so I start adding another layer of shadow with the multiply layer. Oops, added a little too much. Let's erase some in the lightest areas. Next, I add just a little reflection to the eyes to imply the bright lights off of the canvas. Then I'm not quite happy with the amount of light, so I add a little bit more light and continue to mess with blending modes and opacity. I even changed some of the previous layers to different blending modes to get the look that I want. A lot of this just involves playing and experimenting, so try everything. Here's a reminder of what the original looked like. Alright, let's play with a different contrasting lighting. For this one, I want to have a very dark environment with a single light from the left side. Slap on a big dark multiply layer, and then I'll add a light yellow color. During this, I also erase some of the darkest layer like before, to get more contrast. There's another rough example. If I was to continue, I would add more layers and use smaller brushes to get the light to hit exactly where I want on the piece. Let's go back to the first sketch and talk about some niche methods to add fun touches that I really like. The first of these is a dark room and a bright light from a window. I'll mess with some really subtle yellow and then draw myself an imaginary sunlight from a window. After transforming this onto the sketch, I play with blending modes again and add more color to account for the curves of the stuff that the light is landing on. In this case, the person. I keep adding and mixing things up, like adding a small glow from the left and including the soft blue light of the room he's in on the right side. Lots of adjusting blur, blending modes, and opacity to get it just right. Here's a quick before and after. One other random effect I have a lot of fun with is light from fires and floating embers. I make the room dark again and add on an intense orange glow from the right. I don't like how it looks, so I mess around adding more color and blur until I like it. Oh look, if I flicker the opacity, it looks like a flickering fireplace. The embers are super easy, they just involve saturated layers of orange and yellowish white. I blur the different layers and add a glow blending mode to the others. Don't forget that these little embers are also light sources and will cast light on things that they're near. The last of the random useful effects is smoke. This one is even easier. Using a soft, partially transparent brush, we'll add light fluffy color to where we want the smoke or fog to be. Blur the hell out of it and do it again with the other colors. I like using light oranges and bluish grays or greens for smoke. I add a little bit of highlight with a smaller brush size too to give it more depth. There we go, there are some live examples. Now I'll briefly show you all the different blending modes I used on some of the pieces shown at the beginning. One good example of using these lighting techniques to add atmosphere is this piece. Here it is with and without effects. I'll describe the effects to you as we build them up visually. The first is the shadow on the figures, then the one in the background to make it a lot darker since it's nighttime. Then we'll have the light on the figures from the window, and the atmospheric light from the window on the building, the light from the moon reflecting off the snow onto the figures, as well as a few layers for the colorful lights and things that the light falls on. There's a tint on the window, as well as lighting on the snow from the moon, window, and lights on the roof. It's kind of complicated, but as you add these up, it becomes a lot more dynamic. A lot of these old ones were done in Metabank Paint before I switched to Clip Studio Paint, so let's open up the other program. Here's another with effects and no effects. On this one, we have the window lighting technique that I talked about earlier. First, the darkness of the room, then several layers of this window shape that I manipulated to fit the form. There's more darkness in the left corner, and then the rays of light from the window, and a little bit of dust detail. This next one showcases fire as well as a smoke/fog technique. Let's strip this down into base colors. For the background, we have some rolling smoke and then a layer for the darker corners. After that, there's a few shadow and light layers on the figure. Then there's some bright highlights from the fire and the few layers that build the form of the fire on the torch. And then the ash and embers. The last one here shows a really interesting glowing effect and how that light shows on other parts of the objects or figures in the piece. From no effects, we have the darkness of the canvas, and then another dark layer for shadow on the figure. Next is the orange glow for the mask, hoodie, and the words in the background. These all take a few layers of saturated orange and a little white. At the end, there's a little bit of those ember effects we saw before. For the second part of this piece, the effects are almost exactly the same. And that's about it. Blending modes and using these lighting effects is a really great tool in your digital arsenal. It can greatly change the mood of a piece, and it can liven up sketches that seem plain. I hope you found some helpful tips from this tutorial, and make sure to let me know if you have any questions down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thanks for 1,000 subscribers even though this video is a little late. I appreciate you as I improve with making all kinds of videos, and I hope you have a great day. See ya!